I want to talk about 3 things that you need to know about Airbnb. We're going to kick this off by talking a little bit about acquisition. We're going to discuss the concept of highest and best use, and we're going to wrap this whole thing up talking about active versus passive income. So while you're going for your property acquisition, I strongly encourage you to think about some of the traditional rents that you could get and then utilize that to drive your purchase price, with Airbnb just being an added benefit. All right, so let's talk a little bit about rental properties and using them as Airbnbs. Within the last 2 years, started Airbnb-ing out some of my properties. Now, I didn't buy the property with Airbnb as my original intention. I intended to rent out the properties as traditional rental, but then I ended up finding Airbnb and making a lot more money that way than through traditional rental. Buy and hold rentals for a number of years, and one of the types of buy and hold rentals that I really like are multifamily properties that have a main house with some kind of detached living space, like a mother-in-law's quarters, a garage apartment, some kind of detached living space on the same property. I found historically they've been super undervalued to purchase this type of properties. Well, now with Airbnb coming into the game, it's actually driving up the values on some of these properties that historically I've gotten great deals on, because in the past people just looked at the main unit and then evaluated their willingness to pay for the property based on that main unit, almost like they were just totally forgetting about the additional living space that came with the mother-in-law's quarters. Now with Airbnb, in certain markets where Airbnb is getting really hot, people look at those mother-in-law's quarters, they take the Airbnb price for that mother-in-law's quarters along with the rent or Airbnb price of the main unit, and then they say, wow, this cash flow is huge, and utilize that to justify the higher purchase price. Fortunately, when I bought my property that I Airbnb now, I did the numbers based on the rents for the main house as well as the long-term rents for the unit that I'm now Airbnb-ing. As Airbnb started to blow up on the scene in the market where I was investing, I started thinking about, man, I should really be getting into Airbnb rather than a long-term rental. So I spent some money, remodeled the apartment, furnished it, made it look really nice, got some good pictures, got it up on Airbnb, and sure enough, the Airbnb money is almost double the rent that I would be getting on a long-term lease on that same unit. So that's how I got into Airbnb. Definitely intended to have a long-term rental property, but then kind of fell into Airbnb accidentally. So let's talk a little bit about property acquisition. This is where it really comes into play. So when you're working out your property acquisition numbers, you're usually going to start with your rent price, and then you're going to back plan through your repairs to get to your purchase price. This is where people, I think, are possibly going to get in trouble with Airbnb in the future, is now these rent values, instead of being at the market sustainable rent price, they're seeing these huge cash flows from the rent prices, which justifies a ton of repairs, which justifies a very high purchase price for properties that would have been going for literally half what they're selling for now just a year ago. So you really need to be careful in property acquisition that you're not just looking at that highest and best use price, but also a realistic price that you could get once that one form of income goes away, in this case short-term rentals or Airbnb. If that form of income were to go away, what kind of rents could you realistically get, and utilize that to justify your purchase price. Because Airbnb, while it's definitely the future and long-term and short-term rentals are here to stay, there's other factors that can come in with reducing your ability to Airbnb. Homeowners agreements, also the local jurisdictions, your city, your county, even your state can all impact your ability to utilize short-term rentals. The biggest part of this discussion that we have to get to is highest and best use. Highest and best use is a term that you don't hear enough in real estate videos these days, because that is the core of what you're trying to do as a real estate investor. You're trying to optimize the property that you're acquiring to make it generate as much revenue as possible. One of the ways that you can change the highest and best use of a property is by changing the zoning. For example, you see this in a lot of old large houses that have been subdivided into 3 different apartments. Someone took one house that could generate a decent rent and changed it into 3 different living spaces, all generating okay rents that were larger than the one decent rent that the person would have gotten by renting out the one Victorian home, in an older neighborhood. So we can see this where people have changed the highest and best use of a large dated home into 3 apartments that they now rent out. You're essentially doing the same thing with Airbnb. You're taking a single family dwelling and then you're turning it into a short-term stay. So essentially you're turning a rental unit into a hotel. You're changing the highest and best use. Where my Airbnb is, there's a shortage of hotels in a very popular destination. And so by turning a rental unit, a long-term unit, into a vacation stay, I change the highest and best use of that property. I'm fortunate in that my state, city, and county where I have that Airbnb have all started enacting rules to allow Airbnb. They do put some stipulations on it, but that legislation is very lenient on my ability to continue renting out that property as an Airbnb. Because of that, a lot of people are starting to purchase homes in that area based on the highest and best use of a short-term rental. Maybe wise, maybe not, time will tell. I think one of the things that you need to consider though is the highest and best realistic use of a property. I don't know if that's a real term, highest and best realistic use, but lots of times you go look at a property and you think, well, this is what it could be, this is what I could do here. And that's good. You do want to push that vision, but at the same time you have to be cognizant of the fact that there may be zoning laws, there may be HOA agreements, there may be city or municipal codes that prohibit you from reaching that highest and best use. So you have to think about the highest and best realistic use. How much money can I realistically generate as a long-term rental in the case of a single family residence? Another thing you have to hit on with an Airbnb or short-term rental discussion is active versus passive income. So many times you talk to real estate investors and they'll talk about their return on investment. And when you hear these huge gargantuan numbers, it's very apparent that either 1, they're totally lying, or 2, they have passive and active income confused. So, or passive and earned income, depending on what you want to say. But a lot of times when you have an asset that you put a lot of time into, it's not passive income, you're earning your income. For example, on a short-term rental, that thing needs to be cleaned, the yard needs to be maintained, tenants need to be communicated with on a weekly basis, people need to be followed up with. So there's a large earned income component to running a short-term rental. So when you see the huge rent differential on a short-term rental over a long-term rental, don't confuse that as totally passive income. Whereas with a long-term rental, you can go ahead and put the rental on the market, have a property manager take care of it, contract out maintenance, and you can be totally passive with a long-term rental. With a short-term rental, it's still possible, but you need to be in a location where that infrastructure is in place. In a beach town, you're going to have vacation property managers as well as cleaning personnel and maintenance personnel who are accustomed to the quick turn times necessary to maintain a short-term rental. But those services are going to come at a price. So you have to recognize what that's going to take out of your increased rent potential. Also, biggest thing, just think about how much of that income is passive and how much of it is earned, and you got to balance those two when you're picking out your investment.